Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in Critical Theory. It's a podcast that's part of the New Books Network. On this episode, I'm talking to Amín Pérez about Bourdieu and Sayed against empire, forging sociology in anti-colonial struggle. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for having me.
I'm delighted to have you on the podcast. I'm delighted you've written this fantastic book. But before we started, I was saying that Bourdieu is, I guess, maybe one of the most important sociologists in British sociology. He's really influential in US sociology. Obviously, his work is incredibly influential in France and continental Europe. And it's fascinating to see a book that engages both with, I guess, the kind of post-colonial context for Bourdieu, but also introduces a collaborator in Sayed that I don't think is particularly well known, especially for English-speaking sociology influenced by Bourdieu. And the place to start, I mean, I guess that probably motivated the book a little bit, but I'm intrigued as to the kind of motivation to write the book, and I guess maybe what got you interested in not just writing about one of these authors, but both of them together.
Yeah, thank you, Dave, and thank you for this introduction. Indeed, the main reason that pushed me to write this book, it came from the need to underline the political potentiality of sociology, to show how it can formulate tools of resistance and how it can provide the means for an emancipatory project, and this, of course, through the analysis of, first of all, the paradigmatic political experience of the Algerian decolonization from 1954 to 1962, which was also intellectually a very paradigmatic moment where not only Bourdieu and Sayed, I will talk about them in a few minutes, but uh, many intellectuals were at that time portraying a post-colonial society. So my goal was to demonstrate the role that sociology can play specifically to dismantle the structure of domination and the mechanisms that made it happen through this improbable collaboration between a French philosopher and an anti-colonial activist that will collaborate together with their different resources, scholarly, politically resources, to try to understand colonial domination and how to break with this with colonialism. So it was very important for me to trace the origins of this collaboration between the two of them, and of course that through the process of this research, other reasons appear to me important. For instance, as you mentioned, we know better, of course, Bourdieu's work, but Bourdieu and Sayad, who work, we know less his work on immigration, but both of them consider this early experience of research in Algeria to be their most important research experience, and which is paradoxically today their least known work. So it was important for me to revisit these anti-colonial origins of their pioneering analysis on domination and immigration, to uncover, for instance, an almost unknown Bourdieu as a sociologist of colonialism and revolution, to discover through this analysis their thoughts on resistance, solidarity, race, colonial science, such topics that are very important for our neoliberal era today to understand, and to understand how they have already, in the midst of this colonial war and anti-colonial liberation struggle, to understand how they thought about those topics at that specific time. And of course that also the books allow us, or that's my main goal also, to provide history of social science through the revisiting this experience, because I don't only follow in this book their trajectories, their work together, but I also try to locate, to situate their work in a very specific academic and, of course, political context, since the work that they will conduct will be very rare. I mean, people who are working, conducting field work in the midst of this anti-colonial war. So it was also important to revisit that political moment through the documents, because the book is based mainly in the archives, in their letters, notebooks. Not, I don't limit myself to make a revisit from what they have published, but I try to understand their collaboration, their concerns, their preoccupations that push them to work on different field studies at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly interesting to tell the story of almost the birth of sociology in an anti-colonial struggle context, as opposed to, I suppose, the kind of traditional narratives of sociology, which are intertwined sometimes with more traditional, formal Western bureaucratic states. And as you said at the start, the kind of political potentiality, which is a theme I think we might come back to, is really clear in the book, and that's something that we might see in both the relationship between the sociologists, their sociological methods, and the time and place in which they're working. But before we do that, we should probably hear a little bit about who we're actually talking about. And I think sometimes with these grand figures of sociology, we sort of, take almost as read that people will have heard of them and be familiar with who they are. But I think one of the things the book does really well is reintroduce Bourdieu in a way that people might not be aware of, and then obviously introduce Sayed in a way that a lot of people might not be familiar with his work. So I wonder if you could kind of give a little introduction to who both Sayed and Bourdieu are.
Thank you, Dave. I mean, this is important because it was at the heart of my of the method I applied in the book, to first to make a sense of who both of them are and what made this collaboration, this improbable collaboration between a metropolitan citizen and colonial subject possible. I mean, in a context of extreme racial and social stratification of this settlement colony in Algeria, that was also translated into the research and academic practices developed at that time in this settlement colony. So I wanted to, in the first chapters of this book, I go back to at their lives before and during the war to trace the social affinities that made this collaboration possible. And what I found is that besides the different contexts in which they will grow up, I mean, Sayad was born in Kabylia in Algeria in 1933, and Bourdieu was born in Béarn in the south of France in 1930. I see that there is a striking homology in Bourdieu's and Sayad's background. They not only are coming from the same generation, but both of them were descendants of small rural family and were sensitized since their childhood by their family to the injustices of their system in the colony and in the metropole. And both attended the highest scholar institutions in the metropolis. Bourdieu went to the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and Sayad in the colony, he went to the École Normale of Busseria. So, but not without being discriminated against because of their social and ethnic origins in those institutions. And both of them rejected the appeal of academic consecration. I mean, that's the case of Bourdieu, who was in Algeria in 1956, completing his military service, and decided to stay in Algiers in 1958 to understand these societies instead of following, for instance, the PhD project in France with Georges Canguilhem, who was one of the greatest philosophers at that time and which remains today. And for Sayad, instead of continuing, for instance, his preparatory class to the École Normale de Saint-Cloud in France in 1956, the same, he came back to Algeria for his anti-colonial activities. And both of them sought to, I mean, feel useful in this political landscape of the Algerian Liberation War. So it was important for me to understand these trajectories that will push them to meet in the classrooms at the University of Algiers in 1958. Bourdieu is teaching philosophy at that time, and Sayad is going through his psychology career. And but they speak about the present, the violence of the war, and they try to think about how not only to break with the disinformation that comes from Paris to understand this reality, but they try to really understand the means that can break with this colonial domination, and that what it will push them to convert to sociology, to think about the means that this discipline can provide them to understand in another way that it was used to at that time to think about colonialism. So that's their main goal. It was to try to debate, to try to inform. They will describe their project as a public writer, public scribe project of informing based on their knowledge on this society, to better inform, of course, but also to better understand. That was like a precondition to understand the the violence of not only from the war, but also the economic and social violence that has dispossessed the Algerians, to better capture the means that were necessary for to break with this domination.
The book introduces the Algerian context in some detail, and I think it's one of the things that is almost impossible to kind of capture in an answer of maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And it strikes me that one way into understanding the Algerian context is, rather than asking you to explain it, is to ask, as the book talks about slightly later, what are the practices that both men, Bourdieu and Sayed, were actually doing in Algeria? And I think one of the things that comes through really kind of clearly in the book is that their use of sociology allowed them to reveal the kind of social facts, almost the truth of Algerian society. So, yeah, what was their sociological practice, and what does that tell us about Algerian society at the time?
Well, I mean, at the time they met, Bourdieu had already published Sociologie de l'Algérie in 1958, that was translated as the Algerians. And in this book, Bourdieu criticized, for instance, government intellectuals that portray the supposedly backward culture of Algerian, backward culture at the source of their conditions of misery, the ones that intellectuals who minimize also the political mechanisms at the heart of the material and symbolic disarray of the colonized. And Bourdieu also criticized other intellectuals who proposed some reforms without affecting the colonial order. And the originality with the collaboration with the Sayad is in transcending the generalities of certain anti-colonial positions that proclaim, of course, the legitimate project with which Bourdieu and Sayad will align of destroying the colonial system, but which were not having a precise idea of the social conditions that would enable this transformation. So for them, it was important to go beyond what the legitimate speeches and denunciation from Paris did not allow to see, to carry out like a parallel work in Algeria on other realities that were obscured by the war. And they proposed a series of that was pushed them to conduct fieldwork, in the historical dispossession and pauperization of the colonized, produced by colonial capitalism, that was accelerated by the war on the forced resettlement camps, and at the same time to portray the social conditions for the revolutionary consciousness in that specific moment. And it was important to trace, as you said, the practice that they will conduct. What is the originality? Because we know that, for instance, ethnography was conducted already in the colonies by ethnographers, by anthropologists, by sociologists. But what made the difference? Because the point was not to be there to understand the reality. So I try to trace the originalities of this collaboration of to try to see how they not only conduct fieldwork during the wartime, but also on the war. I mean, on political themes instead of following the cultural subjects of colonial science. To do this alongside with colonized writers, poets, activists, intellectuals, that was something very important because before meeting Sayad, Bourdieu had a lot of collaboration with anti-colonial Algerian writers that give him a sense of a voice that was completely marginalized, denied, to understand this specific society. And of course, that the main practice was to produce knowledge from the subaltern experience, to conduct fieldwork combining in Algeria with different teams. It was not only Bourdieu and Sayad, it was a collective team that produced statistics, ethnography, historical, documents from historical perspective, photography. So these kind of practices, for instance, also something very important, the reflexive methods they will apply, because this was commissioned by the colonial state. So how to this is what where we see the reflexivity coming from Bourdieu. How do we get distance from these kind of political concerns from the state? How we need to break with the categories brought from the metropolis that were not meaningful for the colonized subjects. So they try to reject all the questioners, for instance, that were coming from the metropolis, and they say, no, we need to do ethnographic fieldwork to understand the meaning people give to life, the meaning they give in a pre-capitalist society to work, the relationship to politics. So it was important to trace, and that's why for me it was important to come back to the conditions that make this work possible. Again, not to limit myself to revisit their work from what they publish, but from the material, the notebooks, the correspondence between them, to understand what are they looking for and the main concerns that they have. For instance, when Sayad discussed with Bourdieu to say, okay, Albert Memmi, which published a marvelous book on the portrait of the colonized and the colonizer, he says, I agree with him in some aspects, but then there is an impasse of to try to break with colonialism. If we don't take what colonialism it is, it's a relational approach on domination that it not only concerns the colonized but also the colonizers. So it was important for me to reconstitute what made these methods that pushed them to practice sociology in a certain kind of way.
What, I guess, kind of impact did that have in the context both of the war and the struggle, but then in I was going to call it the transition to independence, but that is not an appropriate term, is it, given the nature of Algerian independence? But yeah, what was the kind of impact of their sociology?
Well, during the time of the Algerian Liberation War, I think that Bourdieu's work already was reviewed at that time as a very important work on Algerian colonialism because of his analysis on the total upheaval, control, precarity of the institutional means that the colonial Algeria imposed. Because we need to know that just to give a sense to the audience, it was a settlement colony that, of course, the essence of this kind of system is to privilege the colonizer to the detriment of the colonizer. Were 1 million people coming from the metropole and 9 million Algerian, and it was a process of dehumanization, humiliation, dispossession, expropriation of lands, multiple legals and social barriers against the indigenous people, and of course the question of the political negation of the colonized was essential. So it was important at that specific time. Then, of course, that the results of their work won't be too much listened by the post-colonial independent Algeria, because it also criticized the how this was important. I come back to the analysis. Um, Bourdieu and Sayat, they try to understand not only how colonialism and colonial domination works in that specific moment of the institutional colonialism, but they try to also provide us the means of social emancipation, in the sense that they are very careful of the contradiction that this colonial domination has imposed on the Algerian masses, and how it can be perpetuated after the independence. Independence doesn't mean necessarily emancipation, though. So for them, it was important to trace this long durée approach, political approach on. Okay, we need to be careful, as Fanon has said, on the pitfalls of the national consciousness, that uh, after this independence, there might be some elites that could reproduce these colonial structures, and of course that there are a lot of effects of this colonial deprivation and dispossession, that it will remain on the Algerian masses, on the insidious effects of unemployment and stability, economic insecurity on their social life, that could lead them, to the most vulnerable populations, to resignation, to adhere to the most unbearable conditions, to attack the effects of this to the colonial violence, rather than the structural violence. So for them, it was important to see this, how useful it could be sociology, not only to dismantle the colonial structures, but domination, and of course that their analysis will be rejected by the new elites that will come in Algeria, and that will make a completely distance from the purpose and the principles of the revolution. So for in Algeria, it didn't have an impact, their work, because when they published, for instance, Bourdieu Work and Workers in Algeria in 1963, and Uprooting with Sayad that in 1964, that is one of the rare collaborations and co-author book between a colonized subject, a colonial subject, and a metropolitan citizen at that time. It will they in their last chapters, they try to propose a new politics based on their knowledge, and that will be rejected by the new elites in Algeria and in France. Is it had an impact on their work, but after the Algerian independence, it's true that that specific historical moment and political dimension of their work was rejected. But for other reasons, France wanted to get rid of this defeat of the from their empire, and yeah, this particular dimension of their work were completely marginalized up today. I mean, even the work on Bourdieu conducted on Algeria had been marginalized, opposed to, for instance, the work he has been conducting on education, culture. The same for Sayad. We know Sayad today as sociologist of immigration, but we do not have the sense of his first work, which allow him to understand the colonial experience and how he will of better understand and anticipate the relationship between the state and the post-colonial immigrants. We cannot understand that without explaining his first work on the relationship the colonial state had with the colonized. So, but those works were completely marginalized for other reasons of the rejection of this colonial history in the French Empire today, and of course because of the other reasons, the Bourdieu became a global intellectual social theorist that sometimes we can take it, for instance, for the English speaking audience, we reject the empirical work that made this theory able to have the power of his theory, but we reject the origins, the empirical origins of his work.
Yeah, I'm tempted to just ask you to say more about that, because I suppose the kind of reception of this work in France and then its subsequent disappearance is one of the most kind of fascinating questions that the book, I guess, kind of leaves the reader with. And it struck me there's a sequel of some sort to be written here. I guess kind of tracking that story in a longer intellectual history, or almost, which encompasses broader debates about sociology. But I will spare you that question because I'm intrigued, I guess, to bring us back up to date and to kind of come back actually to where you started. You mentioned this really important phrase, political potentiality, and the end of the book really is, um, and hopefully I've read this correctly, is a kind of defense of sociology and kind of the possibility of sociology as a liberating subject and academic discipline that can be um, positive for changing the world. And it's a slightly kind of trite question, isn't it, to say, well, what lessons do Sayed and Bourdieu have for us today? But I think part of um, you writing the book is motivated to say, if we go back to this forgotten work and to an extent kind of forgotten period, um, forgotten formative period, then we'll understand better the possibilities and potential for sociology. So yeah, what lessons do um, both authors and their collaboration have for contemporary sociology?
Yeah, this is a very important question. I mean, that was at the heart of of the reasons I wrote this book. I mean, sociology is a science that distorts the social order, since it uncovers the means that allow its perpetuation, the mechanisms that produce a certain inertia of the social order. So it was important for me to come back to the origins of their work, to understand uh, what sociology can provide us in the understanding of domination as a precondition to understand the means that can allow people to break with have a rupture with these social structures. And Sayad once insisted that over and above learning the sociological craft from Bourdieu, he owed him the discovery that sociology could write differently about politics, that it could account for, explain, and provide a deeper understanding of a social reality. And I think that that was their main goal at that specific time, where you have, all, of course, during the colonialism and this colonial war, where you have one position that wants to a conservative position that wants to give the means to remain this colonial Algeria, to maintain this colonial order. And in the other side, you have, for instance, some idealistic and prophetic discourses and positions that are important but does not allow the means to completely break with the colonial domination. And Bourdieu said something very important when he was analyzing neoliberalism, that he saw what neoliberalism was 30 years before in Algeria. I mean, this colonial moment allowed him to see the brutality of a state that abdicate its function of social protection and instead provide the means to punish this population. And of course, what does that mean for the people who are much more in a vulnerable position, in a precarious conditions, that yeah, these positions can allow that can bring the people to perpetuate that domination. So for him, it was important. For Bourdieu, for instance, he said sociology can provide the sociological knowledge that it can produce can provide grounded utopias. So for him, as well as for Sayad, it was important to intervene politically based on their knowledge, to provide the social movements to provide and the people who are trying to live in their lives with a very precarious conditions, try to give them means of how to break with domination. So it was important, like, to trace these origins of their work, to understand better, of course, the work that they will extend during the post-colonial era, and what it can, of course, represent to our contemporary society.
And what about your own work? I mean, I mentioned a possible future book contained within this book, but I guess this scale of a project might be one that you don't want to come back to, and maybe sort of a bit exhausted with. So, what are you doing in terms of your future work and your future projects?
Well, in fact, I keep working on this topic, trying to deepen in some aspects of this collective fieldwork during the wartime in Algeria, and studying, for instance, the role of the Algerian literature also in Bourdieu's work before he conducted fieldwork, trying to understand better the relationship also of the transition between the Algerian experience of research and Bourdieu's earliest work in France, because it was conducted at the same time. We cannot disconnect Bourdieu's work in Algeria, on which will allow him to ground the basis of his concepts on cultural capital, symbolic capital, and habitus, on reflexivity, that he will extend in the early 60s, for instance, to his work on culture, to his work on education. So it's important for me also to, at this moment, to come back to that specific moment, and of course to analyze the aftermath of this anti-colonial sociology into later work on both of Bourdieu and Sayad. But also I'm trying to apply these approaches. That's why it was important for me also to come back to these early works on this colonial situation, because it resonates with my personal concerns. I come from the Dominican Republic, and a lot of what they have analyzed is resonates with the realities that in which I grew up, and the realities which I try to analyze in my new fieldwork on the Haitian migrant workers in a post-plantation system, as it happened in the Dominican Republic. So I try to through this work on the sociology of the colonial state, I try to apply it to understand better the violence of the neoliberal state today in the Dominican Republic.